Sarah Mitchell's day began like any other at the Pentagon, with security badges beeping through turnstiles and the familiar hum of classified conversations echoing through sterile corridors. As a senior intelligence analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, she had grown accustomed to the weight of secrets, the burden of information that could shift the balance of global power. At 34, she had already earned 3 commendations for her work in counterintelligence, tracking foreign operatives who sought to penetrate America's most sensitive military installations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now worked in the same building where her father had spent the better part of 4 decades climbing the ranks. Admiral Robert Mitchell was a legend in naval intelligence circles, a man whose strategic brilliance had helped navigate some of the most complex geopolitical challenges of the past generation. His office was 3 floors above hers, in the rarefied air where policy was shaped and wars were planned. They rarely spoke during work hours, maintaining the professional distance that military protocol demanded between a flag officer and his subordinate, even when that subordinate happened to be his daughter. Sarah had inherited her father's analytical mind and his instinct for patterns that others missed. It was this gift that first drew her attention to the anomalies buried deep in the intelligence reports she reviewed that Tuesday morning. The data streams were subtle, almost invisible among the thousands of communications intercepts, satellite images, and human intelligence reports that crossed her desk each week. But there was something wrong with the timing, something that didn't fit the established patterns of known foreign intelligence operations. The first red flag appeared in a routine surveillance report from the Naval Intelligence Base in Norfolk, Virginia. 3 separate incidents over the past 6 months had involved security breaches that were initially attributed to system failures or human error. Each incident had been investigated, documented, and filed away as isolated events. But when Sarah pulled the files and examined them together, she noticed something that the individual investigators had missed. The timing of each breach corresponded exactly with high-level strategy meetings involving Pacific Fleet operations. She cross-referenced the dates with personnel records, looking for any pattern in who had access to the classified information that seemed to be leaking. The list was small, limited to officers with the highest security clearances, and a demonstrated need to know. As she scrolled through the names, her heart stopped. There, highlighted in the system as having accessed the relevant files before each security incident, was a name she recognized: Captain James Morrison, her father's longtime aide and one of his most trusted advisors. Sarah stared at the screen for several minutes, hoping she had made an error in her analysis. Captain Morrison had been part of her father's inner circle for nearly 15 years. He had been a guest at family dinners, had attended her graduation from the Naval Academy, and had even walked her down the aisle at her wedding when her father was deployed overseas. The idea that Jim Morrison could be involved in espionage seemed impossible, but the data didn't lie. She decided to dig deeper, using her security clearance to access financial records, travel documents, and communication logs. What she found painted a disturbing picture that extended far beyond Captain Morrison. Over the past 2 years, he had made several unexplained trips to cities known to be operational centers for foreign intelligence services. His bank account showed deposits that couldn't be explained by his military salary or known investments. Most damaging of all, his personal communication devices had made contact with numbers that intelligence databases had flagged as belonging to suspected foreign operatives. But as Sarah continued her investigation, she realized that Captain Morrison wasn't working alone. The pattern of information access and the scope of the intelligence being compromised suggested a network of individuals working together. She began mapping connections, following the digital breadcrumbs that linked seemingly unrelated personnel across different branches of service and various Pentagon departments. The deeper she dug, the more extensive the network appeared. There were colonels in Army intelligence, commanders in Navy special operations, and civilian contractors with access to some of the military's most sensitive programs. The conspiracy wasn't limited to selling secrets to foreign powers. It involved manipulating intelligence assessments to influence major policy decisions, steering defense contracts to favored companies, and even compromising ongoing military operations. Sarah's investigation revealed that the network had been operating for years, carefully selecting which information to sell and which operations to sabotage. They had been responsible for the failure of at least 3 major intelligence operations, resulting in the deaths of assets and the compromise of vital strategic positions. The financial trail showed that millions of dollars had changed hands, with the proceeds being laundered through a complex web of offshore accounts and shell companies. What made the discovery even more shocking was the realization that many of the conspirators held positions that gave them direct access to the highest levels of military command. They weren't just selling information, they were actively shaping it, feeding false intelligence up the chain of command while simultaneously providing accurate information to hostile foreign governments. The implications were staggering. American military strategy for the past several years had been influenced and, in some cases, determined by enemy agents working within the Pentagon itself. Sarah faced an agonizing decision. The evidence she had gathered was compelling, but it implicated people at the highest levels of the military establishment. Pursuing the investigation would mean exposing corruption that reached into the offices of generals and admirals, potentially including people her father had worked with for decades. It would also mean acknowledging that the intelligence community her father had devoted his life to serving had been thoroughly compromised. She spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing the evidence, double-checking her analysis, and considering her options. She could take her findings to the FBI or the Inspector General's office, but that would mean bypassing military channels and potentially destroying the careers of innocent people who might be implicated by association. She could approach her father directly, but that would put him in an impossible position of having to choose between his loyalty to his colleagues and his duty to his country. Ultimately, Sarah decided that the magnitude of the security breach was too significant to handle through normal channels. The conspirators had demonstrated their ability to compromise investigations and eliminate threats to their operation. She needed to build an airtight case before she could risk exposing what she had discovered. That meant gathering additional evidence, identifying all the members of the network, and documenting their activities in a way that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up. She began working longer hours, using her legitimate duties as cover for her unauthorized investigation. She developed a system for documenting her findings that kept the evidence secure while allowing her to continue building the case. Every piece of information was carefully verified and cross-referenced, creating a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy that would be difficult to discredit. As Sarah worked to expose the network, she began to notice changes in the behavior of some of her colleagues. There were subtle signs that suggested someone might be aware of her investigation. Meetings that were rescheduled when she tried to attend them, computer files that had been accessed by unauthorized users, and casual questions about her current projects that seemed designed to gauge what she knew. The realization that she might be under surveillance added a new dimension of danger to her investigation. If the conspirators knew what she was doing, they would certainly take steps to stop her. Sarah had to assume that her communications were being monitored and her movements were being tracked. She began taking precautions, varying her routines, and using secure communication methods to protect her investigation. Despite the risks, Sarah was determined to see the investigation through to its conclusion. She had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and she couldn't ignore evidence of treason simply because it was inconvenient or dangerous. The security of a nation depended on rooting out the corruption that had taken hold within the military establishment. Her father had taught her that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite the fear. As Sarah prepared to take the next step in her investigation, she drew strength from that lesson. She was about to challenge some of the most powerful people in the military, but she knew that the alternative, allowing the conspiracy to continue, was unthinkable. The evidence she had gathered represented months of careful work and personal risk. Now she had to decide how to use it most effectively. The wrong move could result in the evidence being suppressed and the conspirators escaping justice. But the right move could expose the entire network and restore integrity to the intelligence community her father had served with such distinction. Sarah Mitchell was no longer just an intelligence analyst doing her job. She had become something far more dangerous to the conspirators, a woman with knowledge they couldn't afford to let her keep, and the courage to use it against them. The question was no longer whether she would act on what she had discovered, but how quickly she could move before they moved against her. Sarah knew she was being watched, but she didn't realize how closely until the night everything changed. It was a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of crisp autumn night that made Washington, D.C. feel almost peaceful despite the constant undercurrent of political tension. She had stayed late at the Pentagon, ostensibly to finish a routine analysis report, but actually to make copies of the most damning evidence she had gathered about the espionage network. The underground parking garage beneath the Pentagon was nearly empty by the time she made her way to her car. Her footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as she walked toward her silver Honda Civic, parked in her assigned spot 3 levels down from street level. She carried a standard briefcase, the same one she had used for years, but tonight it contained encrypted flash drives and photocopied documents that could bring down some of the most senior officers in the U.S. military. As she approached her car, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The security camera that normally monitored her section of the parking garage had been repositioned, pointing away from the parking spaces and toward a blank wall. It was a subtle change, the kind that would go unnoticed by most people, but Sarah's training had taught her to pay attention to details that seemed out of place. She pretended to fumble with her keys while scanning the garage more carefully. There were 3 vehicles parked in spaces that were usually empty at this time of night. A dark SUV with tinted windows, a white panel van, and a sedan with government plates. None of the vehicles had anyone visible inside, but Sarah's instincts told her that she wasn't alone in the garage. Her phone vibrated with a text message. Package ready for pickup. Loading doku. It was from a number she didn't recognize, and the message made no sense in the context of anything she was working on. But the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Someone was trying to get her to move to a different location, away from the relative safety of the parking garage. Sarah made a quick decision. Instead of getting into her car, she turned and walked briskly toward the elevator, hoping to reach a more public area before whoever was watching her could react. She had taken perhaps 10 steps when she heard the sound of car doors slamming and footsteps moving rapidly across the concrete floor behind her. She broke into a run, her heels echoing loudly in the confined space. The elevator was 30 yards away, but it might as well have been 30 miles. Behind her, she could hear at least 3 sets of footsteps, moving with the practiced coordination of a trained team. These weren't random criminals looking for an easy target. They were professionals, and they had planned this carefully. Sarah reached the elevator and frantically pressed the call button, knowing even as she did it that she didn't have time to wait for it to arrive. The footsteps behind her were getting closer, and she could hear voices coordinating their approach. She looked around desperately for another option and spotted the stairwell entrance 20 feet to her left. She sprinted toward the stairs, fishing her cell phone out of her purse as she ran. She managed to dial 911 before the first attacker reached her, grabbing her arm and spinning her around. The phone flew from her hands, skittering across the floor and coming to rest under a parked car. Sarah Mitchell, the man said, his voice calm and professional. He was wearing dark clothing and had the build of someone who spent considerable time in the gym. You need to come with us. There are some people who want to have a conversation with you. I don't think so, Sarah replied, using a defensive move her father had taught her years ago to break free from the man's grip. She had studied martial arts in college and had maintained her training throughout her military career, but she had never had to use it in a real confrontation. The second attacker moved to flank her, cutting off her route to the stairwell. He was older than the first man, with gray hair and scars on his hands that suggested extensive combat experience. This doesn't have to be difficult, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. We just want to talk. The use of her rank told Sarah that these men knew exactly who she was and why they were there. This wasn't a random attack or even a simple kidnapping attempt. Someone had sent them specifically to deal with her investigation, which meant that the conspiracy she had uncovered was even more extensive and well-organized than she had realized. Talk about what? She asked, backing toward a support pillar that would give her some protection from multiple attackers. Her military training had included scenarios for dealing with hostile interrogation, and The first rule was to keep the enemy talking while looking for opportunities to escape. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately," the third man said, emerging from behind the SUV. He was younger than the others, with the lean build of a runner and the confident movements of someone accustomed to violence. Questions about people who value their privacy. Sarah realized that they were positioning themselves to surround her, cutting off any possibility of escape. The parking garage was designed as a security feature with limited entrances and exits, but now those same characteristics were working against her. She needed to create an opportunity to get past them and reach help. "I'm a military intelligence officer," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "My job is to ask questions about threats to national security. If that makes some people uncomfortable, maybe they should reconsider their activities." The older man smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Your father has had a distinguished career, Lieutenant Commander. It would be a shame if his legacy were tarnished by his daughter's misguided curiosity." The threat was clear, and it told Sarah something important. These men knew about her relationship to Admiral Mitchell, which meant the conspiracy reached high enough to have access to personnel files and family information. It also meant that her father might already be in danger or might even be involved in the conspiracy himself. "What do you want?" she asked directly. "The files you've been copying," the first man said. "The analysis you've been conducting without authorization. The evidence you think you found. We want all of it, and we want your assurance that you'll forget whatever you think you've learned." Sarah looked at the briefcase in her hand and made a split-second decision. She threw it as hard as she could at the nearest attacker, then ducked her left, rolling behind a parked car. The briefcase struck the man in the chest, causing him to stumble backward, but the distraction only bought her a few seconds. She crawled rapidly between parked cars, trying to put distance between herself and her attackers while staying low enough to avoid being seen. Behind her, she could hear them spreading out, coordinating their search with the efficiency of a military unit. They were calling out positions and movements using tactical communication that confirmed her suspicion that these were professionals, not common criminals. Sarah reached the edge of the parking area and found herself near the loading dock area she had seen mentioned in the mysterious text message. The overhead doors were closed, but there was a personnel entrance that might lead to a different part of the building. She tried the door and found it unlocked, which seemed too convenient, but was her only option for escape. The corridor beyond the door was dimly lit and led toward what appeared to be a service area. Sarah could hear footsteps behind her as her attackers discovered her escape route, so she ran down the corridor, looking for an exit or a place to hide. The sound of her footsteps on the linoleum floor seemed impossibly loud in the narrow space. She passed several doors marked with warnings about authorized personnel only, but none of them offered an obvious escape route. At the end of the corridor, she found a stairwell that led upward toward the main levels of the Pentagon. She took the stairs two at a time, hoping to reach an area where there would be security guards or other people who could help her. Behind her, the footsteps of her pursuers echoed in the stairwell, but they seemed to be maintaining their distance rather than trying to catch up with her immediately. Sarah realized that they might be herding her toward a specific location, using her fear of capture to guide her movements. The thought made her pause at the landing between the second and third floors. She listened carefully and heard something that chilled her, radio communication from somewhere above her in the stairwell. There were more attackers waiting for her, positioned to cut off her escape if she continued upward. She was trapped between two groups of hostile operatives in a stairwell with no alternative exits. Sarah tried to think like the intelligence analyst she had trained to be. Her attackers had demonstrated detailed knowledge of her movements and the building layout, which suggested extensive planning and reconnaissance. They had managed to position surveillance in the parking garage and coordinate a multi-person operation without triggering any of the Pentagon's security systems. That level of sophistication required insider knowledge and possibly inside help. The realization that the conspiracy might include people within Pentagon security made Sarah's situation even more desperate. She couldn't trust that calling for help would bring genuine assistance. It might just bring more attackers. She was completely on her own, trapped in one of the most secure buildings in the world, being hunted by people who had the resources and knowledge to neutralize her without triggering any alarms. She needed to find a way to turn the situation to her advantage, to use her knowledge of the building and her intelligence training to escape from what appeared to be an impossible situation. But first, she had to survive the next few minutes, and the footsteps getting closer from both directions told her that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Sarah Mitchell had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened national security, but now she faced a more immediate threat to her own life. The question was whether she could survive long enough to expose what she had discovered, or whether the people she had threatened would succeed in silencing her forever. Sarah's heart pounded as she heard the coordinated footsteps closing in from both directions in the stairwell. In that moment of absolute terror, her military training kicked in with crystalline clarity. She remembered a conversation with her father years ago about the Pentagon's architecture, how the building's unique design included maintenance corridors and service passages that most personnel never saw. She pressed herself against the wall and felt along the surface until she found what she was looking for, a nearly invisible seam in the wall panel that indicated an access point to the building's extensive utility infrastructure. Using her military ID card as a makeshift tool, she managed to pry open the panel, revealing a narrow maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the stairwell. The space was cramped and filled with pipes, electrical conduits, and ventilation systems, but it offered something her pursuers hadn't anticipated, an alternative route through the building. Sarah squeezed into the corridor just as she heard voices on the landing she had just vacated. The attackers had converged on the stairwell, expecting to find her trapped between them. "She's not here," one of them said, his voice muffled by the wall but still audible. "Check the doors on each floor." She couldn't have gotten far. Sarah crawled through the maintenance corridor as quickly and quietly as possible, following the path of the main electrical conduits toward what she hoped was the central part of the building. The space was pitch black, forcing her to navigate by feel, but it also meant she was invisible to anyone looking for her in the normal corridors and rooms. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, she found another access panel that opened into a supply room on the third floor. She emerged covered in dust and disoriented, but she was in a part of the Pentagon that was far from where her attackers expected to find her. More importantly, she was near the office complex where the senior staff worked, including the area where her father spent most of his time. Sarah looked at her watch and realized it was nearly midnight. The building was largely empty except for essential security personnel and the few officers who worked night shifts. She needed to reach someone she could trust, but her experience in the stairwell had made her paranoid about who might be involved in the conspiracy. The attackers had demonstrated inside knowledge of the building and her movements, which meant they likely had help from someone with legitimate access to Pentagon security systems. She made her way carefully through the darkened corridors, avoiding the main hallways where security cameras would record her movements. Her destination was her father's office, not because she was certain he could help, but because it was one of the few places in the building where she might find secure communication equipment that hadn't been compromised by the conspiracy. Admiral Mitchell's office was on the fourth floor, in a section of the Pentagon that required additional security clearance to access. Sarah used her military ID and biometric scanner, hoping that her credentials hadn't been revoked by whoever was orchestrating the attack on her. The door clicked open, and she found herself in the outer office where her father's aide normally worked. Captain Morrison's desk was neat and organized, just as she remembered from her earlier visits. But now, looking at it with the knowledge she had gained from her investigation, Sarah noticed details that had escaped her attention before. There was an expensive watch that seemed inconsistent with a military salary, business cards from companies she didn't recognize, and photographs that suggested travel to locations that weren't part of official military business. She moved past Morrison's desk to the inner office where her father conducted his most sensitive meetings. The room was impressive but austere, decorated with naval memorabilia and photographs from 4 decades of military service. Sarah had been in this office countless times throughout her life, but tonight it felt different, charged with the weight of what she had discovered and the danger she had just escaped. Admiral Mitchell's computer was protected by multiple layers of security, but Sarah knew the system well enough to access the basic communication functions. She needed to contact someone outside the Pentagon, someone who could help her without being compromised by the conspiracy she had uncovered. The question was who she could trust with information this sensitive. As she considered her options, Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor outside. The sound was measured and purposeful, not the random patrol of a security guard, but the deliberate movement of someone approaching this specific office. She quickly turned off the desk lamp and moved to a position where she could see the door without being visible from the hallway. The footsteps stopped outside the office, and Sarah heard the sound of an electronic key card being used to unlock the door. Someone with legitimate access was entering the office, but at this time of night, it was unlikely to be routine business. Sarah pressed herself against the wall behind a filing cabinet, trying to remain hidden while still being able to see who was entering. The door opened, and Captain Morrison walked in, followed by two other men Sarah didn't recognize. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but moved with military bearing, suggesting they were either active duty personnel in plain clothes or veterans working as contractors. Morrison turned on the lights and went directly to Admiral Mitchell's desk. "She was here," Morrison said, examining the desk surface. The computer was accessed 20 minutes ago using the Admiral's credentials. "She's been here and probably saw everything." "How much does she know?" one of the other men asked. "Too much," Morrison replied grimly. "Her investigation was more thorough than we anticipated. She's connected the dots between the Norfolk incidents, the financial transfers, and the personnel assignments. If she's managed to document everything she's discovered, it could expose the entire operation." Sarah felt sick as she listened to the conversation. Captain Morrison, the man she had known since childhood, was not only involved in the conspiracy, but appeared to be one of its leaders. The betrayal was personal, but it also meant that her father was in immediate danger. If Morrison was willing to use Admiral Mitchell's office for conspiracy meetings, he obviously had no concern for her father's safety or reputation. "What about the Admiral?" the second stranger asked. "Does he suspect anything?" "Mitchell is clean," Morrison said, "but he's getting too close to retirement to be useful. Once he's gone, I'll be positioned to influence his replacement. The new CNO will be someone we can work with, someone who understands the financial realities of modern warfare." The casual way Morrison discussed manipulating the selection of the next chief of naval operations confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. They weren't just selling secrets to foreign governments. They were actively working to place their people in the highest levels of military command. The national security implications were staggering. "The daughter is the immediate problem," Morrison continued. "She's got evidence that could unravel 5 years of careful planning. We need to find her and resolve this situation before she can contact anyone outside the building." "Our people lost her in the stairwell," the first man reported. "She's somewhere in the building, but she could be anywhere. The place is like a maze. She'll try to contact her father," Morrison said with certainty. "Family loyalty is her weakness. We need to monitor his communications and be ready to intercept any contact she makes. If she tries to meet with him, we'll have our opportunity." Sarah realized she was listening to them plan her capture and probably her murder. But she had also learned something crucial. Her father wasn't involved in the conspiracy. Morrison's comments made it clear that Admiral Mitchell was an obstacle to their plans, not a participant in them. That knowledge gave Sarah hope, but it also meant she needed to warn her father about the danger he was in. The three men spent several more minutes discussing their plans to locate Sarah and contain the damage from her investigation. They talked about other members of their network, confirming Sarah's suspicions about how extensive the conspiracy had become. There were people in multiple branches of service, civilian contractors with security clearances, and even some individuals in other government agencies who were working together to manipulate military intelligence and defense policy. As Sarah listened, she began to understand the full scope of what she had stumbled into. The conspiracy wasn't just about money, although the financial rewards were clearly substantial. It was about power and influence, about shaping American military strategy to benefit foreign governments and private interests. The people involved saw themselves as pragmatic realists, working within a system they believed was too rigid and idealistic to function effectively in the modern world. After what seemed like an eternity, Morrison and his companions finally left the office. Sarah waited several minutes to ensure they were gone before moving from her hiding place. She was shaking from adrenaline and the realization of how close she had come to being discovered. But she had also gained valuable intelligence about the conspiracy's structure and plans. Sarah knew she couldn't stay in her father's office much longer. Morrison would certainly return, possibly with more people to search for her. She needed to find a way to contact her father and warn him about the immediate danger. But she also needed to ensure that the evidence she had gathered would survive, even if she didn't. She used the secure terminal in her father's office to send an encrypted message to a secure account she had established months earlier as backup for her investigation. The message contained a summary of everything she had discovered, along with instructions for accessing the full evidence she had compiled. If something happened to her, at least the information would survive. With that insurance in place, Sarah began planning her next move. She needed to find her father and warn him about Morrison's betrayal, but she also needed to do it in a way that wouldn't expose him to additional danger. The conspiracy had demonstrated its willingness to use violence, and she couldn't risk her father becoming another target. As she prepared to leave the office, Sarah heard sound from the corridor that suggested increased security activity. Morrison had probably alerted building security to look for her, using some cover story that would make her appear to be a threat rather than someone seeking help. She was now effectively a fugitive within the Pentagon, hunted by people who had legitimate authority and unlimited resources. But Sarah Mitchell was her father's daughter, trained by the military to think strategically and act decisively under pressure. The conspiracy had made a fatal error by underestimating her determination and resourcefulness. Now she had information that could destroy them, and she was determined to use it, no matter what the personal cost might be. Sarah knew she needed to reach her father, but Morrison's people would be watching all the conventional communication channels and monitoring his known locations. She had to find a way to make contact that wouldn't expose him to immediate danger while also warning him about the conspiracy that had infiltrated his closest circle of advisors. The solution came to her as she remembered a family tradition that dated back to her childhood. Every Friday morning at precisely 0630 hours, Admiral Mitchell ran a specific route through Arlington National Cemetery, a ritual he had maintained for over 20 years. The run was both his personal fitness routine and his way of paying respects to fallen comrades whose names were engraved on the headstones he passed. It was predictable enough that Sarah could find him there, but personal enough that Morrison might not think to monitor it. Getting out of the Pentagon without being detected required all of Sarah's training in tradecraft and her knowledge of the building's layout. She used service corridors and maintenance passages to avoid the main security checkpoints, emerging from the building through a loading dock that was minimally monitored during the night shift. Once outside, she had to assume that her personal vehicle was being watched, so she made her way to a nearby hotel and called a taxi to take her to Arlington. The cemetery was quiet in the early morning darkness, with only the occasional security patrol and the distant hum of traffic from the surrounding roads. Sarah positioned herself along her father's usual running route, near a grove of oak trees that would provide cover while allowing her to see his approach. She had arrived 2 hours early to ensure she wouldn't miss him and to make certain she wasn't being followed. As dawn broke over the Virginia hills, Sarah saw the familiar figure of her father running steadily along the path. At 62, Admiral Robert Mitchell still maintained the physical conditioning that had served him throughout his naval career. His pace was measured and consistent, his breathing controlled despite the early morning chill. He was wearing his standard running gear, Navy PT uniform, and running shoes that had seen thousands of miles. Sarah waited until he was close enough to hear her before stepping out from behind the trees. "Dad," she called quietly, using the informal address that came naturally despite the gravity of the situation. Admiral Mitchell stopped immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in his daughter's appearance. Sarah was still wearing her work clothes from the previous day, now wrinkled and stained from her escape through the building's maintenance systems. Her hair was disheveled, and She had scratches on her hands from crawling through the utility corridors. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've been through a war zone. I need to talk to you about something urgent," she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed. "It's about national security, and it's about people you trust." Admiral Mitchell had spent 4 decades in military intelligence, and he immediately understood that this wasn't a casual conversation. "Walk with me," he said, resuming his run at a slower pace that allowed them to talk. "Tell me what's happened." As they moved through the cemetery, Sarah quickly summarized her investigation and the discovery she had made about the espionage network operating within the Pentagon. She watched her father's expression change from concern to disbelief to grim determination as he absorbed the scope of what she was describing. "Jim Morrison," he said when she mentioned his aide's involvement. "Are you certain?" "I've known him for 15 years. He's been with me through 3 different assignments. I have documentation, Dad. Financial records, communication logs, travel histories. He's been selling intelligence to foreign governments and manipulating classified assessments to influence policy decisions. The network he's part of reaches into every branch of service." Admiral Mitchell was quiet for several moments as they continued walking. Sarah could see him processing the information, probably reviewing years of interactions and decisions in light of what she had told him. His analytical mind was working through the implications, considering how many operations might have been compromised and how many lives might have been lost because of the betrayal. "Last night, they tried to capture me in the Pentagon parking garage," Sarah continued. "I overheard Morrison talking to 2 other people about resolving the situation before I could expose what I'd found. Dad, they're planning to kill me." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah saw something change in her father's expression. The concerned parent was replaced by the strategic thinker who had navigated some of the most complex intelligence challenges of his generation. Admiral Mitchell stopped walking and turned to face his daughter directly. "Do you have copies of the evidence?" "Multiple copies in different locations. If something happens to me, there are people who will know what to do with the information." "Good. That's exactly what I would have done." He paused, considering their options. "Sarah, what you've discovered is bigger than just catching the people involved. If this conspiracy has been operating for years, it means that some of our most important strategic decisions have been based on compromised intelligence. We need to think about how to expose this without causing a complete breakdown of confidence in military leadership." Sarah felt a surge of relief at her father's response. She had been afraid that he might not believe her, or that he might be too invested in protecting his colleagues to take action. Instead, he was already thinking strategically about how to handle the crisis. "There's something else," Sarah said. "Morrison mentioned that you're getting too close to retirement to be useful to them anymore. I think they've been planning to eliminate your influence over the selection of the next CNO. They want to put someone in that position who will be more cooperative with their agenda." Admiral Mitchell nodded grimly. "That explains some conversations I've had recently with people I thought were allies. There have been suggestions that my recommendations for senior promotions might not carry the weight they once did." As they talked, Sarah noticed a black sedan driving slowly through the cemetery roads, apparently searching for something. The vehicle was moving in a pattern that suggested surveillance rather than a routine visit to the cemetery. She pointed it out to her father, and they both moved deeper into the trees for cover. "They found us," Sarah said. "Morrison must have remembered your running routine." "Not necessarily," Admiral Mitchell replied, studying the vehicle's movement. "That could be routine cemetery security, but we shouldn't take chances." He pulled out his cell phone and made a quick call. "This is Admiral Mitchell. I need immediate secure transportation to Naval Intelligence Headquarters. Priority Alpha." Within minutes, a Navy sedan with 2 armed security personnel arrived at their location. Admiral Mitchell explained the situation briefly to the ranking officer, who immediately understood the sensitivity of what they were dealing with. The security team escorted Sarah and her father to a secure facility where they could plan their next steps without fear of surveillance or interference. At Naval Intelligence Headquarters, Admiral Mitchell convened an emergency meeting with the heads of each service's intelligence division, carefully excluding anyone who might be compromised by the conspiracy Sarah had uncovered. The group included people he had worked with for decades and whose loyalty he was certain of. Sarah presented her evidence to the assembled officers, walking them through the investigation that had led to her discoveries. The reaction was exactly what she had expected: shock, disbelief, and then grim determination to root out the conspiracy. These were people who had devoted their lives to serving their country, and the idea that their ranks had been infiltrated by traitors was both personally and professionally devastating. "How do we know this conspiracy doesn't reach into this room?" asked General Patricia Hayes, the head of Army Intelligence. "If they've been operating for years and have people at senior levels, how can we be sure we can trust each other?" It was a valid question, and one that Admiral Mitchell had already considered. Because Sarah's investigation identified specific individuals based on access patterns and financial evidence. None of the people in this room appear in her analysis, and she's had no reason to hide anything from us. But you're right that we need to proceed carefully. The group spent the next several hours developing a strategy for exposing the conspiracy while minimizing the damage to military readiness and public confidence. They decided to coordinate with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and the Inspector General's office to ensure that the investigation would be conducted with appropriate oversight and legal authority. Admiral Mitchell also made a decision that surprised everyone, including Sarah. He announced his intention to accelerate his retirement plans and recommend that the investigation of the conspiracy be led by someone outside the normal chain of command. His reasoning was that his long association with some of the suspects, particularly Morrison, might compromise the investigation's credibility. "This isn't about protecting my reputation," he told the group. "It's about ensuring that when we expose these people, no one can claim that it was a personal vendetta or an attempt to settle old scores. The evidence needs to speak for itself." As the meeting concluded, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that her father had believed her and taken action, but apprehension about what would happen next. The conspiracy had demonstrated its willingness to use violence to protect itself, and now that she had involved senior military leadership, the stakes were even higher. Admiral Mitchell pulled her aside as the other officers left the room. "Sarah, I want you to know how proud I am of what you've done. You uncovered something that could have continued to damage our national security for years. But I'm also worried about your safety. These people have shown they're willing to kill to protect their operation." "I know, Dad, but we can't let them get away with this. Too many people have died because of their betrayal. We won't let them get away with it," Admiral Mitchell assured her. "But we're going to be smart about how we proceed. The next phase of this investigation will be conducted by professionals who specialize in counterintelligence operations. Your part in the active investigation is over." Sarah wanted to protest, to insist that she should be involved in bringing down the people who had tried to kill her. But she also understood her father's reasoning. She had done her job by exposing the conspiracy. Now others would take over the task of dismantling it. As they prepared to leave the secure facility, Admiral Mitchell looked at his daughter with an expression that mixed pride and concern. "You know, this changes everything, don't it? Your career, my legacy, the way people will see military intelligence for years to come." "Yes," Sarah replied simply, "but it's the right thing to do." Admiral Mitchell smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him since their conversation began. "You're absolutely right. And that's exactly what I hoped you'd say." The investigation that followed Sarah's revelations moved with unprecedented speed and coordination. Within 72 hours of her meeting with the senior intelligence officers, the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force had established a secure operations center in a classified location outside Washington, D.C. The investigation was given the code name Operation Lighthouse, reflecting its mission to expose the darkness that had infiltrated the highest levels of military command. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being both a protected witness and a key consultant to the investigation. Federal marshals had moved her to a secure location, but investigators needed her expertise to understand the full scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. She spent long hours briefing FBI counterintelligence specialists, helping them navigate the complex world of military intelligence and understand the significance of the evidence she had gathered. The scale of the conspiracy became clear as investigators followed the leads Sarah had identified. Captain Morrison was just one node in a network that included 47 active duty personnel, 23 civilian contractors, and 6 retired officers who maintained security clearances. The financial trail revealed that over $30 million had changed hands over the past 5 years, with money flowing through offshore accounts to fund activities that range from simple information gathering to complex operations designed to influence major policy decisions. The foreign connections were even more disturbing. The network had been providing intelligence to 4 different hostile governments, sometimes playing them against each other to maximize their profits. They had compromised operations in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, resulting in the deaths of at least 12 intelligence assets and the failure of strategic initiatives that had taken years to develop. But the most shocking discovery was the extent to which the conspiracy had influenced actual military policy. Investigators found evidence that several major defense appropriations had been manipulated to favor companies that were paying bribes to network members. Strategic assessments had been altered to support military actions that served foreign interests rather than American security objectives. In some cases, the conspirators had actually provided accurate intelligence to enemy governments while feeding false information to American policymakers. Admiral Mitchell's decision to step aside from active involvement in the investigation proved to be strategically brilliant. As details of Morrison's betrayal became public, questions were raised about how such extensive treachery could have gone undetected for so long. Critics suggested that senior officers like Admiral Mitchell had either been incompetent or complicit. His decision to voluntarily remove himself from the investigation and accelerate his retirement plans deflected much of that criticism and allowed him to focus on damage control and institutional reform. The arrest began 3 weeks after Sarah's escape from the Pentagon. FBI agents, working in coordination with military police, simultaneously detained suspects at military installations across the country and at several international locations. The operation was carefully choreographed to prevent any of the conspirators from warning their colleagues or destroying evidence. Captain Morrison was arrested at his home in Arlington at 0500 hours on a Tuesday morning. Investigators found additional evidence in his possession, including communications with foreign handlers and financial records that documented years of treacherous activity. His arrest was particularly significant because his position as Admiral Mitchell's aide had given him access to some of the military's most closely guarded secrets. The public revelation of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. and military installations around the world. The story dominated news cycles for weeks, with congressional leaders calling for investigations into how such extensive penetration of the military establishment had been possible. Editorial writers questioned whether the military's promotion system and security clearance processes were adequate to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. For Sarah, the media attention was overwhelming and largely unwelcome. She had never sought to be a public figure, and the spotlight that followed the story's emergence made her uncomfortable. Reporters camped outside her apartment building and tried to interview her colleagues and friends. The attention was particularly difficult because she couldn't discuss the details of her investigation or the evidence she had gathered due to ongoing security considerations. The congressional hearings that followed provided a forum for examining not just the conspiracy itself, but the systemic weaknesses that had allowed it to flourish. Sarah was called to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee, where she described her investigation in carefully limited terms that protected ongoing operations while still conveying the scope of what she had discovered. Her testimony was compelling and detailed, delivered with the precision and objectivity that had made her an effective intelligence analyst. She described the patterns that had first drawn her attention, the methodical process she had used to uncover the conspiracy, and the personal risks she had faced when she tried to expose what she had found. The senators were particularly interested in her assessment of how the conspiracy had been able to operate for so long without detection. The network succeeded because they understood how our security systems work, Sarah explained. They didn't try to steal information randomly or sell it to the highest bidder. They were strategic, targeting specific types of intelligence that would be valuable to foreign governments while avoiding patterns that would trigger routine security reviews. They also cultivated relationships within the intelligence community that gave them advance warning of any investigations that might threaten their operation. Admiral Mitchell also testified before the committee, focusing on the institutional reforms that would be necessary to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. His recommendations included enhanced background investigations, more frequent security reviews for personnel with access to classified information, and better coordination between different intelligence agencies to identify suspicious patterns. My daughter's investigation succeeded because she approached the problem as an analyst rather than as someone protecting institutional relationships, Admiral Mitchell told the committee. She followed the evidence wherever it led, even when it implicated people she had known since childhood. That kind of objective analysis needs to be built into our security procedures at every level. The trials of the conspiracy members began 6 months after their arrests and continued for over a year. The evidence Sarah had gathered formed the foundation of the prosecution's case, supplemented by additional materials discovered during the investigation. The proceedings were largely conducted in closed sessions due to the classified nature of much of the evidence, but enough details emerged to confirm the scope of the betrayal. Captain Morrison received the harshest sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, after being convicted on charges that included treason, espionage, and conspiracy to commit murder. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse for his actions, claiming that he had been serving what he believed were the true interests of American security in a complex geopolitical environment. Other members of the network received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, depending on their level of involvement and the damage caused by their activities. Several plea agreements provided investigators with additional information about foreign intelligence operations and helped identify other potential security vulnerabilities. The institutional changes that followed Operation Lighthouse transformed how the military approaches counterintelligence and personnel security. New procedures were implemented for monitoring access to classified information, conducting background investigations, and identifying suspicious patterns in personnel behavior. The reforms were comprehensive, touching every aspect of military intelligence operations. Sarah's role in exposing the conspiracy led to her receiving several awards and commendations, including the Defense Distinguished Service Medal and the CIA's Intelligence Commendation Medal. However, she found the recognition less satisfying than she had expected. The personal cost of the investigation had been higher than she had anticipated, and the knowledge of how extensively American security had been compromised was deeply troubling. More significantly, Sarah's experience led to her being offered a position heading a new counterintelligence division within the Defense Intelligence Agency. The position was specifically created to institutionalize the kind of analytical approach that had enabled her to uncover the conspiracy. Her mandate was to develop systems and procedures that would make it much more difficult for similar networks to operate within the military establishment. Admiral Mitchell's retirement ceremony was attended by senior officials from across the government and representatives from allied nations who had been affected by the conspiracy his daughter had exposed. In his farewell address, he reflected on the lessons learned from the crisis and the importance of maintaining vigilance against threats that come from within as well as from outside. The greatest threat to any organization is the assumption that loyalty and competence are the same thing, Admiral Mitchell said. We learned that people can appear loyal while actively working against the interests they claim to serve. The answer is not to become paranoid about our colleagues, but to create systems that make betrayal more difficult and detection more likely. For Sarah, her father's retirement marked the beginning of a new phase in her own career. She had proven herself capable of handling the most sensitive and dangerous intelligence challenges, but she had also learned that success in exposing threats often comes at a significant personal cost. The network she had uncovered was gone, but the vulnerabilities that had allowed it to exist required constant attention and vigilance. 6 months after the last trial concluded, Sarah stood in the same Pentagon parking garage where her ordeal had begun. The security cameras had been upgraded, additional lighting had been installed, and new procedures were in place for monitoring personnel movements in secure areas. The physical changes were modest, but they represented something much more significant, an acknowledgement that security was an ongoing process rather than a static condition. As she walked to her car, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that night, when she had first realized she was being watched. The conspiracy was gone, its members were in prison, and new safeguards were in place to prevent similar infiltrations. But she also knew that the work was never really finished. There would always be people willing to betray their country for money, ideology, or personal advantage. The difference was that now there were also people like Sarah Mitchell, trained to recognize the patterns of betrayal and committed to exposing them regardless of the personal cost. The Pentagon takeover she had initiated wasn't just about arresting criminals. It was about fundamentally changing how the military thought about security and loyalty. Sarah Mitchell had started as a dutiful intelligence analyst who stumbled onto evidence of corruption. She had become something much more significant, the architect of a revolution that had transformed one of America's most important institutions. The Admiral's daughter had not only ignited a Pentagon takeover, she had proven that individual courage and analytical rigor could triumph over even the most sophisticated conspiracies. As she drove away from the Pentagon that evening, Sarah knew that her real work was just beginning. The network she had exposed was gone, but the conditions that had allowed it to exist required constant vigilance. She had become the guardian against threats that others couldn't see, the analyst who would ask uncomfortable questions and follow evidence wherever it might lead. The revolution she had started would continue, carried forward by the new generation of intelligence professionals who understood that protecting national security sometimes required challenging the very institutions they served. Sarah Mitchell's legacy would not be measured just by the conspiracy she had exposed, but by the lasting changes she had brought to how America defended itself against its most dangerous enemies, those who betrayed it from within.